Welcome to the second SARE Agent Training High Tunnel Workshop. Today we're going to talk about transitioning to spring in a high tunnel. So just to recap, a high tunnel is also called a hoop house in many parts of the country, and it's a structure used to protect crops from sun, wind, excessive rainfall, and or cold. It's basically a moderated environment and allowing people to moderately control an environment inside. High tunnels are typically passively heated or cooled, although many growers do end up installing fans and heaters. So the principles of season extension, which is a key component of why people have high tunnels, include many advantages and disadvantages. So really, season extension is any method or technique that allows a crop to grow beyond its normal outdoor or open field growing season. So for example, we might be able to have tomatoes in November in Kentucky because of a high tunnel or because of season extension activities. So the advantages of season extension beyond, being able to have something outside of its normal growing season would include possible year-round income, retention of old customers, gain in new customers, being able to ask higher prices for products because they're offered outside of their normal growing season. Higher yields, and that's often associated with higher fruit quality. So you have more fruit that is of higher quality, therefore you're able to ask for higher prices, and your overall marketable yield is higher, right? So it's kind of all connected. Extended employment for workers is also something that several growers have mentioned they appreciate about high tunnels and what they offer. The other thing about a high tunnel is that it allows people to do work even in inclement weather. So if it's raining outside, but you're in your high tunnel, you're still able to get harvest done, or you're still able to prune, and you don't necessarily have to be outside trying to get it done, sloshing around in the mud or wearing a big rain jacket or something like that. So there are disadvantages of season extension. Probably what most people would imagine would mean that there's no natural break in a grower's yearly work schedule. So a lot of field growers have just a built-in break because they can't grow anything in December or January or February, that type of thing. So certainly they're doing other things on the farm, but they're not actively growing things. Increased management demands, so you've really got to be attentive to the inside temperatures of a high tunnel, which means someone needs to be around to roll up the sidewalls or roll down the sidewalls, and make sure things don't get overheated, is often a concern. Higher production costs, so for growers that do install electricity or hook up electricity or gas, right, that is an added cost. Just the materials in general, and the plastic disposal, and the cost that comes with that if you're doing it properly, and where, perhaps you have to drive it somewhere to dispose of it. So the key practices of season extension really include various factors. So site selection is a big one. So thinking about if you need a south-facing high tunnel, do you need that added warmth? So a south-facing high tunnel will stay warmer in the fall and warm up sooner in the spring. Cultivar selection, the number of days to maturity, the cold hardiness, heat tolerance, those are all things people should be looking at when they're selecting cultivars. Use of transplants. So, and when I say that, I'm talking about transplants versus direct seeding. So can transplants can really give an additional week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks of head start to the season. So they also, when you put in a transplant, right, you have a little bit more control. You can see this plant was healthy when I put it in, whereas the seed, may or may not germinate. And you just have a little bit less control of what's happening because you can't see the seed under the soil. Plastic mulch use is really important, and that also includes that woven weed mat that is often used in high tunnels. It's a little bit more resilient than your standard plastic mulch. So you can have black plastic, which raises the soil temperature, or you could have white plastic, which keeps the soil temperatures lower. Row cover use, floating, which would mean that it just kind of is directly on top of a crop, so it's probably touching the leaves of the crop. Hoop supported row cover means that it's going to be elevated a little bit over the crop. That row cover use can really help with extending the season even further in a high tunnel, providing even more cold protection. So at night, for example, a high tunnel is not a lot warmer than it is outside. It doesn't retain a lot of heat. With row cover, you can get several degrees of extra cold protection, which could mean not losing a crop compared to losing one. Shade cloth is also an added component that many growers employ, and it exists in various densities and light transmission percentages, especially for solanaceous crops that can get abiotic disorders such as blossom end rot and is often associated with heat stress. Shade cloth can be another component that could raise marketable yields. So temperature management is really crucial in a high tunnel. So thinking about the different cover material available, there is more than just that 6 mil polyethylene plastic now. That is certainly still the most common thing, but there are other options out there. So when we say 6 mil polyethylene, we're talking about 0.006 of an inch. So that 1 mil is 0.001 and 6 mil is 0.006 inches. That 6 mil poly is usually can usually last about 4 to 5 years if it's applied to the high tunnel correctly and appropriately. Growers can even get a little bit more time on that plastic if patched and taken care of. So the cover that 6 mil poly should be put on in warmer weather, so the plastic will stretch when you pull it over the frame. If you put it on in the dead of winter, you won't be able to stretch it very much, and then you could, when the weather warms up, it will naturally stretch out a little bit. That plastic will warm up and stretch, and then it will be too loose on the high tunnel. And so you can see in the photo here, that is exactly what happened. So it was too loose on the high tunnel, and the wind comes and beats that plastic up against the frame, and it eventually tears. So that plastic only lasted about 2 years, and that's probably a generous description because it already had holes in it. So that 1 to 2 layer question. So using 2 layers of polyethylene can really add a little bit more protection and definitely more insulation. So there is, again, that these degrees of protection, there is more degrees of protection, but again, in the evening when the sun goes down in the middle of the night, there's not going to be a significant difference between the inside of the high tunnel and the outside. Now, if the wind's blowing, that's a different story. You'll get a significant benefit from having that high tunnel, but the two layers really does add a nice insulation factor. So if you do have two layers, you will need an inflation fan, which is shown in this photo to the right, to blow air between those layers. You don't want those layers touching, right? So if those two layers touch, the moisture and the mold will build up, and you'll also get less light transmission. So you can have low tunnels in a high tunnel, low tunnels are a component of row cover, another aspect of row covers. Low tunnels offer the ability to grow select crops through the winter, even outside. People could just use low tunnels. Temperature management is really key again. You could get heat buildup. It's surprising how warm it can get under there, even when it's cold outside or cold in the high tunnel. You do, as you can see in the photo, you have a lack of light penetration. So there's various densities of this row cover. And the choice of fabric or plastic really depends on goals and management options. So in my mind, plastic would be employed for low tunnels that are going to be a little bit more permanent. Fabric row cover or fabric on low tunnels would be something that would be perhaps removed, taken off, that kind of thing, maybe daily or weekly or periodically, right, throughout the season. So thinking about growing guidance with low tunnels and row covers, and just growing guidance in cold seasons, right? So coming into spring, it's still pretty cold. So add about 25% or more to your main season days to maturity when planting in the fall, and then even more in later winter or early spring, so that whatever the days to maturity are on the cultivar you've selected, that's not going to be what you see in the field or in the high tunnel or in these low tunnels, right? It's too cold. So we're extending the season. We're outside of this crop's ideal planting date, which is okay, and it's totally doable, but just have your expectations adjusted for that additional days to maturity. So if it was normally 100 days to maturity, right? If you had a crop that was 100 days to maturity, add 25% to that, and so it'd be 125 days, for example. So you want to optimize for light transmission and temperature management, which is tricky, right? If it's sunny outside but it's cold, there is kind of a balance that needs to occur. So with low tunnels and row covers, we are trying to extend our harvest and keep plants alive. In January or February or maybe even March, you're not expecting a lot of new growth, but you do want to keep things alive. So getting into March and April, right, you should be expecting more growth. You have more daylight hours. It's a little warmer. You can start removing that row cover more frequently. So just some things to keep in mind. And so here are some photos of row cover inside a high tunnel. You can see we've got the hoops stretched out. In the photo on the left, the hoops are stretched out kind of over 2 rows. And so that helps extend your hoops. You don't need to have as many hoops. It also keeps the row cover a little lower, so you can kind of stretch it out over more of the beds. In the case of this broccoli here, we're basically at the point of the hoop. The broccoli is outgrowing the hoop. And so pretty much shortly after this photo was taken here in the middle, we had to remove the hoops in order for the broccoli to fully mature and grow. So some things to keep in mind. In the case of the broccoli, that was okay because we're not selling broccoli leaves. So as long as, the row cover can sometimes freeze to leaves, and it doesn't happen so much in a high tunnel, but because we're not selling the leaves of broccoli, right, we're less concerned with a little bit of damage here and there in that case. So advantages of row cover, right? Frost protection in the spring and the fall from increased temperature under the cover. More rapid plant establishment and growth in the spring and the fall from increased temperatures. Creates a protective layer around your plants and can keep pests off or out. So thinking about using a really thin row cover in the spring and summer to just exclude pests. So you'd want to use the lightest possible row cover you could have if that is your approach. Row cover is relatively inexpensive, and it can be reused from year to year. It does tear, especially the thinner stuff, so you do need to be careful, but it really is reusable, and it really does have a lot of advantages. So here is some specifications for row cover. So the lightest, as I was talking about the insect barrier, the lightest density and the highest light transmission is an Agribon 15. There's off brands and other brands of row cover, but that's just an example. There's also something called Protect Net, which is more of a mesh for that insect barrier. The general frost protection, that would be Agribon 19. That's still pretty light. And I would say, once you get into October, especially here in Kentucky, October, November, December, January, you're going to want at least an Agribon 30 and probably more of an Agribon 50 weight. So that would be like a 1.5 ounce per square yard. You'd have really low light transmission, 50% light transmission, but you would get a pretty good frost protection, somewhere between 6 to 8 degrees of frost protection could be possible with using a heavy row cover. And certainly you could double up on row covers. So 2 lighter row covers would be better than just one if, for example, you didn't have an Agribon 50. So management styles vary based on crop and temperatures desired. You could decide to leave on all winter versus ventilating. And I kind of discussed that earlier. So heat management is really crucial. And then the frames of some kind to hold up the fabric offer an additional frost protection. So there's a little bit more of a microclimate with those hoops. Row cover considerations. So the pests, insects that could become trapped under the row cover. So you want to be as pest free as possible when you start to put row cover on. Pests can overwinter in the soil near the host plants and then could emerge the following spring. So it could kind of provide a mini habitat for certain pests. I mentioned this before, they can rub or injure stems and foliage during windy weather. And if directly touching plants, they can freeze to leaves. So they can be challenging to use on tall plants. Just make sure you have the right width of row cover and if you're using hoops, that you've got big enough hoops if that's what you need. And if you need pollination, row cover must be removed for pollination of certain crops unless you're going to add bees under the row cover, which is a possibility. So row cover can be draped directly over plants and held to the ground with rocks, boards, bricks, pretty much anything heavy. Don't use soil to cover up row cover. You don't want to introduce weed seeds or deal with getting the row cover any dirtier than it needs to be, because you want to reuse it the next year. Leave slack in the row cover so that plants have room to grow and there's some movement possible. You don't want it to be pulled extremely tight over a hoop. It works works well for single rows of plants or wide rows of beds. I kind of showed the different options in earlier slides. And then you could, with low tunnels, right, you could build reusable frames from wood or PVC pipe, and make more of a permanent low tunnel, as you can see kind of in this photo to the right. So managing what we call a shoulder season, right, this early spring or late winter, you really ideally you'd want plants to thrive, not just survive, but sometimes you get just survival, and so you need to budget in for cloudy days and low temperatures where plants may just be surviving. How much of a season do we gain by being able to plant early or extend plantings or crops later than originally intended? You're probably getting a few weeks. So, for example, if you plant tomatoes in mid-March, you're going to be needing to utilize row cover to keep them alive. And they can stay alive even in pretty low temperatures. There is a little trade-off there, right? They're not thriving, they're surviving. So you do get, even though you've planted way ahead of time, you're not necessarily going to be, even though a tomato plant's normal days to harvest, right, is 60 to 70 days, you're not going to see that. So if you plant in mid-March, you're not going to be able to harvest mid-May because of those cold temperatures that have, and that, remember that 25% plus added to the days to maturity. So just keep that in mind. Limitations would be, those cool soil temperatures for germination of direct seeded crops and day length for winter growth and regrowth. So plants ideally need more than 10 hours of daylight, which we don't have in the winter in Kentucky. December through sometime into January, I believe, we have less than 10 hours of daylight, or November to January, we have less than 10 hours of daylight. So that's just something to keep in mind. There are limitations we cannot avoid. Diversified high tunnels can be difficult to manage at transition time. So keeping that in mind, the more crops you have in your high tunnel, probably the more time consuming it's going to be. And the row cover on or off question may be a little bit more difficult to answer depending on how many crops you're working with. So cool season and warm season crops obviously have different temperature requirements. And so prioritizing which crops and how you're going to manage the high tunnel, how cool you're going to keep it, right? If you have some overlap there with your cool season and warm season. For example, if you've got lettuce and kale from that winter in the high tunnel while you're putting in tomatoes, right? So what are you going to prioritize? And one thing that probably will help you prioritize is what's your big moneymaker crop, and how, what are your clients or your customers expecting? And that should help you decide how to manage. So then also a few more tips for successful high tunnel transitioning into spring. Ventilate. So, open the tunnel up as much as possible when you can. So on a sunny day, if it's truly very sunny, very few clouds in the sky, even if it's cold, you may want to open up the high tunnel just to get some air movement, and it may be easily 20 degrees warmer inside the high tunnel, which 70 degrees is a little warm sometimes for, especially stagnant air, a little warm sometimes for greens, for example. So have that row cover ready to go ready to use for that added cold and frost protection. So if you're wanting to plant things early, just be prepared for cold temperatures. And, even in April and May in Kentucky, we can have frosts. And so have that row cover on hand. Remove the row cover on sunny, warm days in a high tunnel, or sunny days in a high tunnel, because the tunnel will be probably pretty warm. Harden plants off before transplanting. So if at all possible, when you're taking plants out of the greenhouse, give them, some sort of transitional space where it's not super warm, it's not a perfectly controlled environment. Let them toughen up a little bit before you transplant them. And then consider using that plastic mulch or the woven weed mat. It just makes things, it will help warm the soil up, and of course that added weed protection, the weed management is always beneficial. And then utilizing sticky cards or sticky traps to monitor for insect pests. So they shouldn't be used. Some people kind of put them out there and just leave them. They're not meant to be utilized as an efficient pest management, right? They're meant for monitoring and scouting. So you would need to watch what's going on the sticky cards and then make decisions based off of what's on the sticky card, right? Do I need to spray? Do I need to put on this, thin row cover for pest management? What's happening here? The sticky cards alone are not going to protect your plants, for example. Lastly, here is a high tunnel planting calendar for annual crops. So you can find this on the UK CCD website. You can see there are regions that this corresponds to. So region 2 is the central Kentucky region. There's region 1 and 3 as well. So just pay attention to where your county is and what region you would be in. And then, of course, there's colors indicating whether it's direct seeding, transplant, or perhaps an overlap of the two. And then there's a color indicating the harvest time period. And this is a fairly conservative temperatures and dates, and so keep that in mind. It's not intended for those risk takers out there. It's purely a guide to help people plan and keep things in mind. So with that, that is some things to keep in mind with respect to transitioning to spring in a high tunnel. Thank you.